The desert was quiet enough to hear a heartbeat from a mile away, and that afternoon the only sound riding the wind was trouble. Caleb Morgan had learned long ago that silence in the West never meant peace. It meant something was waiting, something with fangs or bullets or a grudge. He was fixing a fence line near the dry creek bed when he heard a sharp gasp cut through the heat, a sound too sudden to belong to the land. He turned in time to see a woman stumble from behind a cluster of sagebrush, her hand pressed to her ankle, her face pale as dust, and behind her, a rattlesnake coiled in warning, tail shaking like a warning bell in hell itself. Caleb moved without thinking, boots pounding the dirt as he closed the distance. The snake struck again, but he was faster, driving his hat down to distract it, and grabbing a nearby branch to push it back. The woman swayed, her breathing uneven, and when he reached her, he saw the 2 small punctures on her ankle. Fresh and angry, she tried to speak, but her words dissolved into pain, and Caleb knew that every second mattered in the open country. Where doctors were hours away, he carried her to the shade of his horse, lifted her carefully into the saddle, and steadied her as he climbed up behind her. His arm locked around her waist to keep her upright. The ride to his ranch house felt longer than any cattle drive, the sun burning overhead while fear burned inside him, not because he knew her, but because he knew what snake venom could do if left unchecked, and he refused to let death claim someone on his land. When they reached the ranch, he laid her on the wooden table inside the cabin and worked quickly, tying a cloth above the wound, cleaning the bite with boiled water, and keeping her still while he rode to fetch the small medicine kit he kept for emergencies. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, and in a weak voice she told him her name was Lila Hart, though it sounded more like a whisper carried by the wind than a declaration. Lila was not dressed like the women from nearby towns. Her boots were worn but polished, her dress practical yet carefully stitched, and her hands showed neither farm work nor city softness. When she regained enough strength to speak clearly, she explained that she had been traveling west to claim a small inheritance left by an uncle she barely knew. The land lay beyond Caleb's ranch line, and she had chosen a shortcut through the creek bed to save time, a decision that nearly cost her life. Caleb listened while keeping a watchful eye on her breathing. He had seen strangers before, some honest, some running from trouble, but there was something steady in her gaze. Even in pain, she thanked him more than once, insisting she would repay him for saving her, though he waved the idea away, saying anyone would have done the same. Yet deep down he knew not everyone would have risked their own safety for a stranger. As evening settled over the ranch, the sky turning gold and violet, Lila sat propped against pillows by the window, watching the land stretch beyond the fence line. She asked questions about the cattle, the weather, the nearby towns, and Caleb found himself answering longer than necessary. Her curiosity felt genuine, not like the polite inquiries of visitors. And when she smiled, despite her discomfort, something unexpected stirred in him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. By nightfall, her fever had risen slightly, and Caleb stayed close, dipping cloths in cool water and pressing them to her forehead. The cabin felt smaller than usual, the air charged with unspoken thoughts. She looked at him with gratitude that lingered a second too long, and when their hands brushed while passing the water basin, the touch sparked like lightning across dry grass. Neither of them spoke about it, but both felt that the day had changed something permanent. The snake had struck in the dust. Yet another kind of danger was already taking root inside the walls of that quiet ranch house, and neither the desert nor destiny intended to stay silent for long. The fever broke before dawn, but it left its mark on Lila, like a summer storm leaves scars on dry land. Caleb had stayed awake through the night, listening to her breathing, watching for signs of poison spreading. When her eyes finally opened, clear and steady, relief settled over him heavier than any saddle. She tried to sit up too quickly and winced, and he gently guided her back down, telling her the body heals faster when pride stays quiet in the morning light. The ranch looked different to Lila, not wild and dangerous but steady and honest. She thanked him again, this time with a softness in her voice that made him look away. Caleb was not used to being thanked in a way that lingered. Most folks paid for help with money or left without a word. But she spoke as if his kindness had changed her path forever, and in truth it had changed his too. He brought her a cup of strong coffee and sat across the table, the cabin quiet, except for the ticking wall clock and the distant lowing of cattle. She asked about the land deeds and how far her inherited property lay from his fence line. Caleb explained carefully, telling her the boundary roads and the water rights. Their conversation stretched longer than necessary, and somewhere between maps and morning light, they began sharing stories that had nothing to do with snakes or survival. News traveled fast across the territory, and by midday a rider arrived with dust on his coat and trouble in his eyes. He spoke of a small group of claim jumpers moving through the region, men known for pushing settlers off valuable land. Caleb listened without expression, but Lila noticed the change in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened, and she realized that her inheritance might not be as simple as a piece of paper and a signature instead of fear. Lila felt determination rise inside her. She had survived the snakebite, and she refused to let greed take her future. She asked Caleb if she could accompany him to inspect the property boundaries. Even though her ankle was still tender, he hesitated, but she insisted she was stronger than she looked, and something in her steady gaze convinced him to agree. Though he vowed to keep her close, they rode side by side across the rolling land, the horizon wide and endless, wind tugging at their clothes. Caleb showed her the creek lines and grazing paths, explaining how cattle needed water access to thrive. Lila listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and as they moved through the landscape together, trust began replacing the cautious distance that had existed between them since the day she arrived. Near the far boundary marker they found signs of disturbance, tracks cutting across the soil and a broken post lying in the dirt. Caleb knelt to examine the marks, recognizing bootprints that did not belong to any neighboring rancher. Lila felt a knot tighten in her stomach, realizing that someone had already tried to claim her land before she could even stand on it herself. The West was not only harsh, it was competitive and unforgiving as they stood together surveying the damage. The afternoon sun casting long shadows, Caleb noticed Lila did not step back from the challenge. She spoke about hiring local workers, about protecting the boundary, about building something lasting. Her confidence impressed him more than he expected, and when she turned to him with gratitude shining in her eyes, he felt the same spark from the cabin return, stronger now and impossible to ignore. The snakebite had brought her to his ranch, but the fight for her land was beginning to tie their futures together in ways neither of them could untangle. And as the wind swept across the plains, both understood that the real danger was no longer hidden in the brush. It was waiting in the choices ahead. The tension that had been quietly growing between Caleb and Lila finally surfaced the evening the claim jumpers returned. This time, not hiding their intentions, 3 riders approached the ranch boundary with bold confidence, demanding that Lila sell her inherited land for a fraction of its worth. Caleb stood beside her on the porch, his hand resting near his belt, not threatening but ready. Lila did not step behind him as expected. Instead, she walked forward and told the men the land was not for sale, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. And in that moment, Caleb saw not a fragile traveler but a woman who had learned strength the hard way. The leader of the group laughed and tried to intimidate her with talk of delays, legal confusion, and lonely accidents in the desert. But Lila surprised them by revealing she had already spoken with a nearby town clerk and filed her ownership papers properly. She had prepared while recovering from the snakebite, using every spare hour to secure her future. Caleb felt a surge of respect watching her stand firm, and when the men realized she was not easily shaken, they left with warnings instead of threats, promising to return if she refused to cooperate that night. The ranch felt different, heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb and Lila sat on the porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. She admitted she had been afraid when the men arrived, but refusing them had felt more important than fear. Caleb told her he had faced gunfire before, but rarely had he seen courage that did not carry a weapon. Their conversation softened, shifting from defense to dreams, and she spoke about building a modest home on her property, planting crops, and creating a safe place rather than a contested one. Caleb found himself imagining that future with her in it, though he tried not to let the thought grow too large. He had spent years believing his ranch was enough, cattle, fences, and quiet mornings, but Lila's presence made him realize that land without connection could feel empty. She glanced at him under the fading light and thanked him again for saving her life, yet this time her gratitude carried warmth, not just appreciation. And when their shoulders brushed as they stood to go inside, neither moved away. Over the next few days they worked together, repairing the broken fence and reinforcing the boundary markers. The physical labor gave them reason to stay close without awkwardness, but every shared glance held unspoken meaning. Caleb noticed how Lila laughed more easily now, how her confidence grew as her ankle healed completely, and she noticed how protective he was without being controlling, giving her space to decide her own future while quietly standing ready to defend it. One afternoon, while securing a fence post, a sudden storm rolled across the plains, wind whipping dust into the air and thunder shaking the ground. They rushed to secure the livestock, moving in sync as if they had worked together for years. Rain fell hard, soaking them both, and when they finally found shelter inside the barn, breathless and laughing, the moment felt intimate and unguarded. Lila reached to wipe rain from his face, and the simple touch carried a weight neither could ignore. In the dim light of the barn, surrounded by the scent of hay and damp wood, Caleb admitted he had never expected company to change his life. He had been prepared for danger from snakes or men, but not for someone who could look at him with trust and admiration. Lila confessed that when she first met him, she thought he was just another rugged rancher, but now she saw patience, integrity, and quiet loyalty, and she realized her heart had shifted without permission, drawn to the very man who had carried her to safety. When the storm passed and the ranch settled into calm, they stood together at the edge of the property line, the sunset glowing behind them, the land no longer feeling like a battlefield, but like a shared promise. Lila reached for Caleb's hand and told him she did not want to repay him with money or gratitude alone. She wanted to build something lasting beside him. Caleb squeezed her fingers gently, understanding that saving her from a snakebite had been only the beginning, because in rescuing her life, he had unknowingly invited love into his own. And as the wind moved softly across the plains, they knew their story was no longer about survival. It was about partnership, courage, and a future written together under the endless western sky.